All right. So what we've been talking about is the facts regarding the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Once we got through the core thing that we have to understand, which is that God exists. Now we're going through. Um, we talked about the fatality of the cross, and we talked about the post death appearances of Jesus. And this week, what we're going to talk about is that the disciples were committed to the point of death. They were so committed to having seen the resurrected body of Jesus that they were willing to go to the death for it. Right? And the big verse that he uses in the book is Acts 8:1. It says, "And on that day, a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions." So now that we've established that Jesus' wounds on the cross were fatal, that was chapter 5, and that individuals were claiming that he appeared to them bodily after his death, that's chapter 6. It's time to consider even further evidence that these claims are true by examining the commitment level of those who made them. This chapter amounts to only one of several necessary steps in demonstrating the truth of the resurrection. It refers to the evidence that is possibly the most powerful evidence. Right? People talk, left, right, and center about this evidence, and some people say it's good evidence, some say it's not good evidence. I tend to lean to the side that it's good evidence, that this is pretty powerful stuff, right? And perhaps the strongest data for the validity of the resurrection is the truth that men will not die for a lie. Right? Church tradition holds that each of the apostles died a martyr's death for preaching the resurrection of Christ, with the exception of John, who was boiled in oil and then banished to Patmos. Modern investigators, however, cannot demonstrate with absolute certainty if or how all the disciples were martyred. But we can say with absolute assurance that they were at least willing to die. Right? So I can't say 100% for certain that Peter was put on a cross upside down. I just don't have that information within, what we consider to be good, sound historical documentation, right? We do know that Peter was willing to die. So was John, right? Because we look at the book of Acts, right? They were willing to die. They were willing to go to prison, right? Paul was willing to die, willing to go to prison. But the Jewish leaders and the Romans wanted an end to the chaos surrounding the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth. Right? So this question is the one that we have to ask. Why would these men all die for something they knew to be untrue?
That's right.
Right? People say, people will die for what they believe all day long. Mm-hmm. These guys were in a unique position, though. Right? They weren't believing this. They weren't in a position to believe or disbelieve this to be true. They were in a unique position because they knew whether or not it was true. Right? So when you put yourself in their shoes, you have to think that, okay, they've either seen the resurrected Jesus or they haven't. And if they've seen the resurrected Jesus, they were willing to die for it. If they haven't seen him, now they're willing to die for a lie. Mm-hmm. So, we've got this problem here, right? The disciples were all from different walks of life, and it is prohibitively unlikely that they were all brainwashed, right? It's just unlikely that you're going to get 11 guys plus 1 plus 2, right? To go to the death for something that they knew to be a lie. And even if they were lunatics, the fact remains that they would have seen the dead body of their former leader. Right? Gary Habermas, he says, remember that their continual willingness to suffer and even die for those beliefs indicates that they sincerely regarded their beliefs as being true. Many people die for what they believe is true, but it is not reasonable to think that an entire group of men would be willing to suffer horribly and die for something they all knew was false. Right? Once again, we've got this unique position that they're in. They're in this unique position of they can know whether or not it's true. And J.P. Moreland, he's another New Testament scholar, he says, the disciples had nothing to gain by lying and starting a new religion. They faced hardship, ridicule, hostility, and martyrs' deaths. In light of this, they could never have sustained such unwavering motivation if they knew what they were preaching was a lie. The disciples were not fools, and Paul was a cool-headed intellectual of the first rank. Right? Even people who don't believe in Christianity, they say that Paul was an amazing philosopher. Right? He's one of the top philosophers that we can read from the first century. There would have been several opportunities over 3 or 4 decades of ministry to reconsider and renounce a lie. Right? So then the question is we've got to produce one man in history who has ever died for something he knew to be untrue for no recognizable reason, right? And then we'd have an argument against it. Some would cite suicide bombers, but Muslims truly believe what they're dying for, right? The difference is these guys aren't eyewitnesses. They don't know for sure whether their religion is true or false, right? Others might cite lunatics like Jim Jones, but cultic leaders are insane, right? If the resurrection did not really happen, the apostles would have known they were dying for a lie. And people just don't do that. So once again, we look at the objections and they get a little technical, right? We can, you can go back in a book and look at it later, but how do we know that early Christians died for their beliefs? This contention is an attempt to undercut the claim that the disciples or early Christians were committed even to the point of death. However, it's a misunderstanding of the claim. Though a historian would be hard-pressed to deny they were martyred for what they believed, the case that we make for C hinges on the truth that these believers were willing to die for their belief. And once again, we can't prove with absolute certainty how any of these guys died, right? But we just need to be able to show that they were willing to die for that belief. It may seem like a subtle difference, but but it's a big difference, right? But then we also have Tacitus, who asserted that Nero blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome, and this alone demonstrates the persecution. These persecutions are so well documented inside and outside of the Bible that the burden of proof would be on the skeptics to show that they did not occur. Right, so that's really what we're getting at here is the burden of proof is solely at this point on the non-believer, because we have strong evidence, and somebody would have to come against it. Right, C is for commitment because of the strong commitment level of early believers. They were willing to die for their beliefs in the resurrection. He says when he explains this to students, he chooses one of them as an example. I ask, what if we all wanted to make up a religion right here tonight? We claim that Mr. Pollard, he's using just a name there, was shot by an intruder and lay dead for 30 minutes before resurrecting. Let's imagine the bullet hole closed before our very eyes. After the news found out about it, we might all be asked to appear on the National Morning News program. Now the religion, which has come to be called Pollardianism, is born. The story might catch on, and some of us begin to write books on the subject. Those of us sitting here tonight could soon become wealthy and famous. Now, a man catching you in a dark alley, placing a gun to your head and demanding that you admit the truth or else you will be killed. I think we would quickly abandon our Pollardian beliefs. Right? So what he's getting at here is most of us aren't willing to die for the truth, let alone die for a lie, right? Um, Men will live for a lie as long as it might mean money, power, other such things. When such attractive benefits begin to evaporate and are replaced by the prospect of death, people find it difficult to maintain their deceit. Some further explanation will almost certainly be necessary. In a post 9/11 world, the question Muslim extremists are willing to give up their lives for Islam springs immediately to the minds of listeners, right? But he's talking about there's a huge difference. Wow, this is a short chapter. There's a huge difference between the Muslim who is 1,200 years after Muhammad or 1,300 years after Muhammad, and the Christian who was with Jesus and Jesus appeared to after his resurrection, right? So we know, we can flip flip open almost any Christian history book, and we can see that the church was willing to suffer, especially the early church. We talk about the early church fathers, and a lot of them were killed in quite interesting ways. There was a guy who had his head tied to an anchor and then on a ship in the water, and they weighed anchor, and that's how he died. There's stories of Peter being, hung on a cross upside down. These are guys who were there. I guess Clement is shortly thereafter, but there's stories of John the Apostle being burned or being boiled in oil. And when he didn't die, that's when they sent him to Patmos. We've got to remember that their willingness to suffer extended beyond just this suffering. It was to the point of death, right? He says men may live for a lie, but they will not die for one. And we can look at any of the other things, and this is what it means when he's talking about the commitment, the C for commitment. It's there's really no getting around the powerful evidence of the commitment of these believers who would have been able to know that Jesus was not raised from the dead. Wow, that's the end of the chapter. That's a really short chapter. So, you got any questions, sister?
No, I'm looking at these questions, but I can't pick a answer for none of them.
The C stands for commitment, right?
Okay.
So just tell me, men will live for a lie, but they will not die for one, right? We understand that. It's just kind of, yeah, they'll live with a lie, but
yes,
the instant
right.
somebody's like, change your lie or you're going to die, are they going to change their lie? Absolutely, right? And then, why is the commitment level of the early church different from modern Muslims? Because they knew what was true. They knew that the resurrection was either true or false. The Muslims, they have this word that just passed down and down and down and down and down to them, 1,300 years later. So that's the biggest difference between the early church and the Muslims. And what's wrong with the claim that the disciples were just brainwashed? You think you could brainwash them all? Right?
I don't think so. There have to be some. If it's even one in that group would have said no.
Right.
I don't think all of them would be brainwashed.
Well, you'd also have, people who were there that converted apart from the group, who say they saw a risen Jesus, namely James and Paul, right? We have those two. James is Jesus' half brother, and he's like, no, I got nothing to do with him, right? As we think about Palladianism, right? if you were the guy, if you were the one who they're like, you got to change your mind or I'm going to shoot, would you stick with the truth or would you go with the simple answer, right? That's what he's talking about there. And, you know, and a quick summary of it is just that the disciples were so committed to the resurrection of Jesus that they were willing to die for what they knew to be true. Right? That's really what that's about. Does that answer the questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Number 3, what was the answer again? Why is the commitment level of the early church different from modern Muslim faith?
Okay, so do modern Muslims know whether or not what Muhammad taught was really
True.
what the book says is what Muhammad actually taught?
Oh, okay.
Do the early
They
church
don't,
know?
they don't know, right? They don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah. So, the early church was there to know that it was true,
Yes,
right?
yes.
These guys just believe it. There's a difference between belief and knowledge.
Unknowing, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, well, I'm gonna stop the recording.